Now, when you create a UI, just like with almost any other Microsoft development environment, you generally follow this pattern. You add a control to the UI, you set properties of the control like its width or height or whatever property you need to modify, and then you hook up event handling code so that the control can do stuff, interact with the user, handle interesting things happening as part of the application. Using C# and XAML, there are a number of different ways to add a control to the design surface. You can add a control from the toolbox in Visual Studio directly to the design surface. You can add a control in the XAML view declaratively. You can either type it or drag it there from the toolbox. Or you can create the control in code at runtime. Although this is most likely a review, let's step back and look at simple ways to create controls in Visual Studio using XAML. In Visual Studio, I'll create a new blank project, and I'll name it Controls 1 for our first demo. In the markup, I'd like to modify the layout for mainpage.xaml. It takes a moment for the designer to load, but once it does, we can edit it directly. Here you have a choice of how you view the designer. I'm currently at 100%. That doesn't really fit, so I'm going to go for like 50% so I can see a little more of it on this little screen real estate that I have. Here I have a grid, and I know that because here I can see I have a grid. I'd like to add a second row. Actually, right now there is one row. I'd like to have two. So I can come here in the margin and just click. You can see the orange line indicating that when I do click, I'll create a new row. You can see that what I've created in the markup there was a grid.rowDefinitions element that is a child element indicating the row definitions property of this grid, and that row definitions property contains a collection of row definition elements defining the rows inside this grid. Now I would like to have another grid inside that first row. There are a couple ways I could add that. I'll start by coming here to the toolbox, choosing a grid, and just dragging it over. Now when I do that, they place it where they think best, and at this point you can see horizontal alignment has been set to left, the height is set to 100, the margin is set to some odd value, the vertical alignment is set to top, and the width is set to 100, and I really don't want any of those settings. So I can remove them all, because the only thing I want to do is have this grid fill the entire space. So what I actually need to do is delete everything but horizontal alignment and change that to be not left, but stretch. And once I do that, the grid will fill its entire space. Now in our row definitions, here you can see that for the main grid, I've set up a row definition of 19 star and 109 star. I didn't pick those numbers. The designer did when I placed that grid there. And just to make this clear, the star means use a proportional amount of space for this row given the number here. So 19 star and 109 star, say add those two numbers together. That gives me something like 138. And this will be 19 138ths of the height. And this will be 109 138ths of the height. Well, those are just silly numbers put there by the designer. What I really want is the height for the first row to be auto, which means it's just tall enough for the contents of that row, and the second row to fill in all the rest. Once I do that, of course, I don't see anything for the first row because since the grid has nothing in it in that first row, automatic height means 0. So it's really not very helpful to do that right now. So let me put this back to some number where I can see something, say 100, and that will make the first row exactly 100 pixels tall, and the second row, with an asterisk, fills in the rest of the space. Now, in this top grid, I'd like to add a second column. So I can go to the margin again, and this time add a second column. And you can see that I've selected the inner grid because the vertical line only fills that grid. If I'd selected the outer grid, the vertical line would fill the entire outer grid, but that's not what I want. I want to create a new column in the inner grid, so I'll place that column there. And again, I now have column definitions defined with two arbitrary numbers defining the relative widths of those columns, and I'll modify those in a bit. I'm going to add a button to the second column, so I'll go to my toolbox and get a button and drag it over to my second column. And now there is a button in the second column, and it's awfully small. We'll fix that in a bit. But now that the button's there, I can make the width of the second column be auto, just big enough for that button. And if you notice the button, it has a margin of 516 on the left, which we really don't want. Actually, what we do want is a margin of like 5 all the way around. And once I do that, you can see that I have a margin of 5 around that button. Now you might wonder, why is that first row so tall? Well, if you'll recall, we set the row height to be 100. I really want that to be auto, and once I do, that top row is just tall enough for the button and its 5 pixel margin on the top and the bottom. And you can see that here. Let me zoom in a little bigger so you can see it more clearly. And there we are. We have a button with a 5 pixel margin on its top and its bottom. Our second column, if we look at the internal grid, has a width of auto, so it should just be wide enough for that button. Given that, we don't need to specify 227 star for the width. We can just say star. It doesn't change the behavior, it just makes it a tiny bit cleaner. Now I do want to point out that if you like, you can modify the width of controls. Let me place a button, say just right in here for now. And give it that button, I can resize it by dragging within the designer, and you even get little markers that indicate the current size of that button. I can move the button as well, and you'll see I get a marker at the top that indicates its margin from the top of the cell it's in. And if I could see it, we would see over here an indicator showing us the margin from the left of this cell. I don't really want this button, so I'll delete that. And let me get this back so I can see the whole thing. I can choose Fit All, so I can see the entire layout within the design surface that I have. Now for that button we just created, I want the content not to be button, but to be go. Because you haven't figured this out yet, what I'm creating here is a very simple web browser. We're going to add a web view control and a text box. That's pretty much it. So we'll be able to type in a URL, click the Go button, and the bottom portion of this grid will show us the website we've asked it to navigate to. All right, so we've set the button's content property to Go. We need to make sure its horizontal alignment and vertical alignment are both set to stretch. Let's find the button. Well, it's not. Let's set this to stretch. I need to set this to stretch. So it'll fill the space it's got. Grid.column indicates to the markup which column of the two that we have this button should go in. If we don't specify that property, it would go in column 0. Or we could explicitly indicate we want it to go in column 0. But in this case, I want it in column 1. So we should end up with markup somewhat like this. And actually, I don't think I want that margin after we're done here. So let me get rid of the margin. And there we go. And boy, it's hard to see that thing with all those markers there. And maybe now you can see the Go button. I will zoom this back up so you can see what the Go button looks like now. And there it is, filling in its entire column within the grid. I want a text box in this first column, and there are a number of ways I can do that. I could drag one over, or I could, within the grid, just add one myself. Doesn't matter where I put it. Let me type text box. There we are. And there's our text box. and we'll need to set some properties of the text box. Let's set horizontal alignment to be stretch. There we go. I'll set vertical alignment to be center, so it'll float centered within the cell. I'll set the margin for this one to be 5, 0, 5, 0, and that indicates a 5 pixel margin on the left, a 0 pixel margin on the top, a 5 pixel margin on the right, and a 0 pixel margin on the bottom. The 4 values there go from left, top, right, bottom, just around the edges of the text box. And by the way, this is redundant. If I just say 5, 0, it uses 5 for left and right and 0 for top and bottom. So that's a shorter way to get the same behavior. For text wrapping, I need to specify that I don't want any wrapping. So I'll set this to no wrap. And notice that I'm allowing the editor to type in the quote marks for me. It'll save you lots of time and energy if you just let them type the quote marks. Don't fight the editor. That's my first word of wisdom for you here. So we have a text box here and a button here. The text box is in the 0th grid column because we didn't specify otherwise, and the button is in the column number 1. Notice the columns are numbered starting at 0. Now we'll need a web view control in the 2nd row of the main grid. So let's find the main grid. I wish I had a little more real estate here to work. I really don't. So we have to work very carefully to make sure we're working at the right place. Now I'm within the main grid. Let me add a web view here. And again, I can drag it onto the screen, or I can just drag it directly into the markup. So there's our web view, right where I defined it. We need to set some properties of the web view. Let's set its grid.row property to be 1. So it goes in the first row of our main grid. There we are. We'll set its horizontal alignment and its vertical alignment to be stretch. Horizontal alignment equals stretch, and its vertical alignment equals stretch. And something doesn't appear right here. It looks like the text box and the web view are overlapping. So let's carefully review the markup and see if we can figure out what's going on. First of all, we have in our main grid a row whose row definition height is auto, the other who's a star. That's fine. Then we have a web view in grid.row1. Horizontal alignment is stretch, vertical alignment is stretch. That's fine. Then we have another grid, but we never specified what row it was in. As a matter of fact, it says the grid.row span is 2, which means, since we didn't specify otherwise, it's in row 0 and it spans 2 rows. Well, that's clearly not what we want. We want grid.row equal to 1. So it goes, not 1, 0. We want grid.row equal to 0, so it goes in the 0th row. That's our row here. And this web view should go in grid.row1. And that should be down below. Well, let me reformat this just so I can make sure it formats correctly. Let's see what we have now. We have here for our grid a funny margin as well. Why do we have that odd margin? I don't know. So let's get rid of the margin, and now things look like they should. Phew! It's always best to examine the markup carefully to ensure you know exactly what each attribute in the markup is doing. When I placed that grid on there by dragging it on, the designer set some properties which aren't what I wanted. So I manually fixed them up here in the markup. So again, we have a web view in row 1, a grid in row 0, and within that grid we have a text box in grid.column0 and a button in grid.column1. Now we need to set the names for these controls because we're going to want to refer to them in code. Now I could set the names by setting attributes here in the markup, but the Properties window makes this very easy. For each control, they've extracted the name property and placed it here at the top. So for the text box, I can just come here and change the text box name to URL text box. For the web view, I can change its name to be demo web view. And finally, for the button, which is way over here at the top, there it is, I'll change the name property to be Go button. And for each of these, you can see that the markup has been changed to add a name attribute. You're probably wondering why the name attribute has an X colon in front of it, but the other attributes don't. And that's a ramification of the namespaces that are defined up here. Notice that we have a namespace defined as X, which is http:/schemas.microsoft.com/winfx/2000, whatever. The X namespace generally defines properties that you refer to from code. That's just a standard way of referring to these things. The default namespace here is things that don't have a prefix in front of them, no letter with a colon or anything. Those come from a different namespace, presentation, and those are UI-related properties. When you see an X colon in front of an object's attribute, you'll know that it's something you'll be referring to from code. Now, just to make things even more confusing, the default namespace also defines a name attribute, and it works interchangeably with the X colon name attribute. So the moral of this story is it doesn't really matter whether you use name or X colon name, but the designer inserts the X colon name attribute for you when you assign the name here in the properties window, and it's a little more proper to do that. In any case, we've laid out our markup. We have 3 controls in 2 grids. Let me save everything, build it. I'm superstitious, I always build before I run, and I'll press F5 to run our project. There you go. Not terribly exciting. I can type as many URLs as I like in here. I can type Microsoft.com, click the Go button, and nothing is going to happen because we never added event handling code to make things happen. That'll take a few extra steps.